Paulina Alberto is professor of African and African American Studies here at Harvard University. She's also a history professor. Paulina Alberto is a historian of Afro-Latin American lives, thought, and politics as they unfolded in the aftermath of slavery, particularly in Brazil and in Argentina. Welcome to Faculty Voices, Paulina.
Thank you, June. It's so nice to be here.
Could you tell us generally a little bit about your own personal background and your professional path?
Yeah, happy to. So I'm originally from Buenos Aires, Argentina. My whole family's from there. They're actually not from Buenos Aires. They're from the interior, from the province of Santa Fe. So I'm the only porteña or Buenos Aires born person in my family. And when I was young, we moved around a lot because my mother was a diplomat for the Argentine Foreign Service. She was one of the first women in the Argentine Foreign Service. And her first post when I was 2 years old was to the consulate in New York. She was the cultural attaché. And so I grew up in New Rochelle, New York until I was 9, and then moved back to Buenos Aires for several years. And then from there, ended up going to part of middle school and high school in Mexico City, which was my mother's next post. So I finished high school in Mexico City, which changed my view of Latin America. It was a fantastic 7 years. And from there, I came to the United States to go to college and then stayed on for graduate school and basically have been living here since.
And you came to Harvard from?
And I came to Harvard from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, where I had been teaching since 2005. So 17 years there before I moved here.
That's really interesting. Your childhood experiences have been in places like Mexico and the United States and Argentina that have very different concepts of race.
Yeah, that is precisely the catalyst for my interest in thinking comparatively about race in the Americas. New Rochelle was one of the school districts that was most integrated. I went to public school. I had many African American friends. And then when I was 9 and we moved back to Buenos Aires, the contrast was stark. I didn't see people who I thought of as being Black or Afro descendant. When I asked, I was told that there were no Afro descendants in Argentina. There never had been, or some people said, well, there were, but it was a long time ago and that population has, quote, disappeared, which is the foundational myth I then go on to write about in my most recent book. But that was what I grew up hearing. And I sort of assumed that that was a difference between the United States and Latin America. But then, because, children draw vast conclusions from very small pieces of information as best we can to try to make sense of the world. And then I did spend a lot of time in Brazil when I was little because I had an aunt and an uncle who had fled the dictatorship and moved to Sao Paulo. And so that brought down my theory that the distinction between the United States and Latin America was that, like Argentina, there hadn't been an African presence because, of course, Brazil has the largest population of African descent outside of Africa. So then that reformulated my whole sense of Latin American history in a new way. And I started to wonder about that. At a very early age, of course, I wasn't asking the questions in the way I would ask them once I got a PhD, but I was very interested in these differences and the way people talked about them. So that really shaped my interest in history and society and sort of where I wanted to head as I moved into college.
What about Mexico, which has such a strong myth of mestizaje?
Yeah, being in Mexico was also very different to me because I realized, oh, not only do Argentines talk about ourselves as if we had no Afro-descendant population, but there's also no myth of mestizaje and no kind of acknowledgement of an indigenous population. So being in Mexico, on the one hand, seeing the extent to which the indigenous past was so key to national pride, right? The way that it is enacted in urban space through monuments, through the way that archaeological sites are revered, the way that I learned Mexican history in a Mexican school. I went to the American school, but it was partly in English, partly in Spanish, and a lot of the instructors were Mexican, and you learned Mexican history. First of all, this tangible presence of an indigenous past was fairly new to me, and the pride in it. At the same time, I could see that, especially as you moved amongst people from the upper classes, because the American school that I went to had a lot of very wealthy Mexicans in it, that those people mostly did not think about themselves that way and did not claim indigenous ancestry mostly. And that likewise, Mexican popular culture, a lot of it put forward people who looked white and blonde. That contrast was also something I realized. So at the same time, starting to notice that the idealization of whiteness was something that was very common across Latin America, even though demographically countries could be quite distinct. And even if they had a very strong sense of pride in their Afro descendant or indigenous roots.
So you're a white Latina girl going to school in Mexico and Argentina and in New Rochelle. Why didn't you just adopt, like, okay, I'm white like everybody else? What was the factor that made you really interested in this concept?
I didn't feel white like everybody else in the United States, for sure. I felt very different. I felt very foreign. I didn't even know that Latina was a thing. I didn't know that many other people of Latin descent in the United States who were sort of first or second generation. Maybe I did, and I didn't realize the broader community that they belonged to. I basically was very much the child of foreign diplomats who were in a place for a few years, like children do. I made friends at my school, but I didn't really think about how I fit into the ethnic identities in the United States. I just knew I felt foreign and different. In Argentina, I didn't realize I was white because whiteness is not a thing that people talk about very explicitly. It only comes up in contrast to something else. I think I realized it more once I left Argentina and I started hearing these stories about how Argentines were, not particularly beloved and welcome in other countries because of the ways that Argentine travelers tended to interact with other countries, having a kind of sense of superiority that was about class, about education, but also about race. And I was mortified by that. And I disidentified with that. And in fact, tried my hardest at different times in Mexico to blend in and tried to develop a way of speaking that downplayed being instantly identifiable as an Argentine, because I realized fairly early on that Argentina held this place in Latin America that could be seen as aggressive in its defense of its own kind of cultural and racial Europeanness. I very quickly felt like that was something not to be proud of.
In any of your schools, you actually taught about race?
Not in Argentina. I mean, for the colonial period, we learned that there had been indigenous populations. I don't think I learned that there had been Afro populations, that there had been people of African descent who had been enslaved. That was not in the books at the time that I was going to school in the 80s, maybe in other schools. There were allusions to it for national holidays, holidays that were called the colonial period in the 19th century. There were characters like La Negrita, the Black woman street vendor who sold pastelitos or sweets. And sometimes there were illustrations of this figure, and sometimes, not in my school, but other schools would actually have children dress up as these colonial characters, and they would do so in blackface. And it was completely normalized. And still is in many cases. I mean, the debate is beginning to change now, beginning to be more consciousness about this. So no, race in Argentina was not kind of an analytic category through which you taught people about the past. There were people called Indians, but race as a way of analyzing society and as something that you would also turn in on the white majority was not something that was discussed at all. In Mexico City, because it was an American school and because we read many of the classics of US literature, there was more of a conversation about race, mostly in terms of a kind of Black-white dynamic. And again, there was a conversation about the indigenous past, but not a lot about race as a category of social distinction and inequality in the present. Although that was something that I began to sense in Mexico through some of the readings in a couple of anthropology classes, and that I became very interested in part because I think I sensed that it was not really being talked about.
So at what point did you decide to go on an academic path to investigate race?
Yeah, well, I was very interested, not in race alone, but I was interested in the combination between race and colonialism when I was in college. Very early on, I became very interested in the history, not of Latin America, actually, the history of European colonialism in Africa in particular, and India to some extent, but I became increasingly interested in African history and the way that ideas about racial difference were produced in this context of colonialism. But little by little, I started to find my way back to Latin America. So I ended up writing my senior thesis in history about enslaved people's medicinal practices in Jamaica and Haiti, and the links to political upheavals in both places. And as I was getting ready to go to graduate school, I thought I was going to keep working somewhere between British Empire, but I was starting to think about connections to Latin America. I wasn't sure which way to go. And I had an advisor, a person who was very influential. And when I was writing my senior thesis, the French historian Lynn Hunt, who was a cultural historian. And she said, you really ought to just focus on Latin America. You're obviously interested in Latin America. It's a booming field. We need more people doing work on Latin America, and we need more Latin Americans doing work on Latin America. And I thought, okay, she's probably right. And so I kind of took the plunge. A lot of people apply to graduate school in the field that they had been doing their undergraduate primary source research in and their coursework in. And I felt like I sort of flipped a little bit. So I came into graduate school pretty new to the field of Latin America, and not in an experiential sense, but in an academic sense. And at that point, I first thought, well, maybe I should come back to this question of the Afro-Argentine population, because after all, we had a wonderful book by historian George Reed Andrews that was published in 1980 called The Afro-Argentines in Buenos Aires. And that book blew my mind, completely transformed my sense of what I had been told about Argentina, which is that this disappearance was not so much a disappearance as a transformation in the categories through which race was understood, such that Argentina really did have a significant Afro-descendant population, but it became absorbed into the category of white, and that category of difference became erased. So people stopped being able to largely ascribe themselves that the category of negro or Afro-Argentino or clase de color, these changing terms, and the state stopped recognizing it, right? So a lot of people who have African descent in Argentina might not know it after several generations. That book was incredible, and I thought, is there more work to be done? But this was 1997, and the field of Afro-Latin America did not yet exist. We had case studies from some countries, primarily countries that had larger populations of African descent. And I kind of got the message that Argentina was not going to be a productive place to try to study for this topic for someone who was just starting out and trying to write a dissertation. And perhaps that was solid advice. So I thought, well, I've always been interested in Brazil because of the time that I spent there. And nobody can tell me that Brazil is not a place with a significant presence and an incredible literature that was already developing, and rich archives, and a very robust Black press for the 20th century. So that's where I decided to head for my graduate work.
And you've kept up that interest ever since.
And I've kept up that interest ever since, although when I did finish my dissertation, which then became my first book on Brazil, at that point, by 2010, 2011, and as I was thinking about what my next project was going to be, I realized that the conversation on race in Argentina had been shifting. And it had been shifting enough. There was more of a field, there was more explicit talk about race, about the African presence, about indigenous movements, Afro-descendant movements, that I thought, okay, now is a time when I can go back to Argentina and ask those questions and actually come back to them with a much better sense of what I was asking, thanks to the very developed field that existed in Brazil in which I was trained.
Do you have any sense of why that shift took place in Argentina?
One of the key dynamics, this is often referred to as a process of ethnic reemergence or revisibilization in the late 20th century, both for Indigenous people and for Afro-descendants. And the key there is visibilization, right? These are populations that were rendered invisible, but they never went away. And even though some people may have lost touch with their African ancestry, there were always people throughout the 20th century who were very aware of descending from people who had been enslaved on Argentine soil and keeping up certain kinds of cultural practices and trying to have an associational life, right, that still was built around these racial solidarities. That kind of core of sociability and a consciousness, right, of the continuity of the African legacy on Argentine soil never disappeared. But what happened is that the conditions for that to become a political and social identity that could be claimed in public life changed. So one of the things that changed is the return of democracy, right? The transition to democracy in 1983 and the rise of social movements. And in particular in Argentina, human rights discourse, these very special power that human rights discourse had in the Argentine case allowed activists of African descent to begin talking about the fact that they had been the first disappeared, that if there had been a legacy of political disappearances, violent political disappearances through the military dictatorship, state violence, killing of subversive people identified as subversives and leftists, that the same notion of being politically disappeared by the state in a kind of genocidal manner had been suffered as well by populations that in an earlier moment of state formation and state authoritarianism were deemed unfit and unsuitable. And so they drew this comparison with political disappearances in the framework of this human rights discourse to make this point. And then I would say that another important impetus for Afro-descendant mobilization was indigenous mobilization, which was kind of in some ways, I don't want to say farther along, that's not the right term, but had more institutional openings to attach itself to. So the new constitution in Argentina that was written in 1994 made space for acknowledging, well, it didn't make space, it was a space that was gained by indigenous movement to acknowledge the pre-existence of indigenous peoples. And so this started to open cracks in this notion of homogenous Argentine whiteness that had supposedly been achieved by the early 20th century, in which all forms of racial difference had been blended into this melting pot, not a melting pot of mestizaje, but a melting pot whose result was whiteness. That was the myth. And this begins to crack that myth. And then I think another major turning point was the economic crisis of 2001, 2002, which really shakes Argentine society, which leads to many, many changes in government, successive changes in very short spans of time, and shakes Argentina's image as a kind of stable, middle class, and also white place, because suddenly it becomes evident that Argentina has many migrants from the interior who perhaps do not look traditionally, quote, white, the way residents of Buenos Aires imagine themselves largely to be, but also there are many migrants from other countries who are of indigenous or mestizo background or even African background, Afro-descendant background, but that Argentina as a whole has to think itself in new ways. There are these new narratives that start to bubble up, at first born of crisis and a crisis of self-image, but increasingly more positively as Argentina reaches the bicentennial in 2010, because of the advent of national populist government, right, with the Kirchners, who start to re-signify Argentina's lack of homogeneity through terms of pride, right? This is what people have called kind of the darkening or the browning of Argentina in this period. And as a mark of solidarity and fraternity with other Latin American nations, rather than asserting a kind of difference and superiority to other Latin American nations, as Argentina had for much of the 20th century. And also increasing contacts with other Afro-descendant movements, which are sprouting up across Latin America after the 2001 Durban Conference Against Racism in South Africa, in which Afro-Latin American activists were really consciously connecting to each other and trying to come up with a strategy that could be continental.
You talk in your writing about racial storytelling in the classroom. Could you tell us about how that racial storytelling is used and what your experience has been teaching across disciplines, languages, and sources?
Yeah. So racial storytelling is a concept that I came to in part by reading other theorists who have been writing about race for a long time and thinking about race, of course, as something that is constructed through schema and stereotype and other building blocks of both cognition and language. And I was sort of grappling with this and trying to put together a notion of racial storytelling. And then at some point, I had the great fortune of finding Imani Perry, who is now my colleague in AAAS, her wonderful work on what she calls racial narrative. And she talks about the difference between something like stereotype and schema, which works in a flat and schematic way, and thinking about narrative, which has the power to, this is drawing on theories of narrative persuasion, the idea that stories and narrative have a way of bringing you in and appealing to your affective ways of cognition rather than the more data-driven ways, and pulling you into a world and making you see the thing that the author or the narrator wants you to see. Imani Perry has a wonderful chapter on racial narrative in her book, More Beautiful and More Terrible, which lays this out. That really helped me crystallize a lot of the things that I'd been thinking about. But I'd been thinking about it in some ways previously too, for two reasons. One is I had been teaching in Romance languages because at Michigan, my appointment was partly in history and partly in Romance languages. And I'd been teaching courses in Spanish and in Portuguese, sometimes in both, about what I called racial fictions in Argentina and Brazil. So these were novels or works of fiction that were loosely historically based and centered themes of race, racial disappearance, racial mixture, racial reemergence, depending on the century and the author. And I was trying to find a way as a historian in a Romance languages class to give students not just historical background, but also a quick way to understand historiography. In other words, the different ways that scholars had written over time about what was going on with racial formation in Latin America, right? I found myself explaining that there was one way of thinking about, for example, Argentina's whiteness that was extremely celebratory. And that way of thinking about it was what many 19th century thinkers like the later Sarmiento or like Jose Ingenieros in the early 20th century, who were really drawing from some North Atlantic ideas about white supremacy, they were thinking, well, look, Argentina is a success story because we started out with this mixed population that had indigenous people and people of African descent and some local Spaniards with their backwards Spanish heritage, which was, of course, a belief of many of these 19th century thinkers who would have preferred to have been colonized by Northern Europeans. They tell this story of this pessimistic view of the Argentine population, and then they tell a triumphalist story in which, through good government and liberal ideologies and the promotion of European immigration and the literal transplantation of millions of European immigrants onto Argentine soil, and the belief that mixture with these white immigrants is going to result in a homogeneously white society, they celebrate the achievement of essentially a European society on Argentine soil. This is in the early 20th century. So I try to tell students that that was the vision that was pretty much in operation for much of the 20th century. And then I say, okay, but then there's another way of looking at this. It's a similar story. It tells that same story of the rise of a white European society, but it tells it in a tone of denunciation. It says, okay, this happened, but this was achieved through genocide of indigenous people. It was achieved through war and the violent occupation of land, the dismemberment of families who were sent across Argentine territory when pressed into all kinds of service. It was done through the disproportionate service of Afro-Argentine men in wars where many of them died. It was done through this process of forced assimilation that led to invisibilization. And so, yes, you end up with what looks like a white society, but the means were extremely violent, right? So I said, okay, well, what do we call that? So I started thinking, well, if we call the first thing a rosy legend or a white legend of Argentine society, then maybe we call this one a black legend, thinking about the kind of denunciation that was already present in the black legend of the Spanish conquest of the New World, which of course exaggerated the extent to which Spanish cruelty, which cannot be denied, but it exaggerated the extent to which that ended up leading to the complete annihilation of a people. So I say, okay, what are the pros and cons of telling the story this way? Well, it emphasizes violence and cruelty, but at the same time, it ends up erasing the Afro-Argentine population almost just as much as the first story, right? So what other versions are there? So then, we came up with, well, around 2010, with this kind of browning of Argentina, novelists were coming up with what students and I ended up calling a brown legend of Argentina, which is essentially kind of a traditional mestizaje view, except, it's happening in Argentina. It's being developed in the early 21st century, whereas in other parts of Latin America, this was put forth, in the late 19th and early 20th century. So there's kind of like a coming very late to the idea that Argentina might be a mixed race society. So I found that by labeling these forms of thinking about race that had existed, I could really give my students tools to identify and work with different historical tendencies, but also to think very clearly about the implications about telling a particular kind of story and the kinds of conclusions that we draw from them. And then it opens space for students to think very carefully about, okay, well, if they had to tell a story based on some primary sources, what are the things that they would want to be very careful to think about, right? So as not to end up with some of these pitfalls that can sometimes happen if you're swept along into pre-existing narratives. And then we look at the ways that more recent historians have tried to grapple with this, right? And how they're sometimes trying to walk a fine line between denouncing violence, but not asserting such extreme victimization that the people at the center of their stories, you can't really flesh out their kind of decisions and choices as they went through their lives, right?
You use the term Black legend, which brings us to your book, Black
Yeah.
Legend, The Many Lives of Raul Grigera and the Power of Racial Storytelling in Argentina. He's a fascinating character. He's a
Isn't it?
black celebrity, Buenos Aires nightlife, the early 1900s. But how did you stumble on this figure?
Oh, I mean, this man led such an incredible life. The biggest challenge throughout the more than a decade that I worked on this book was trying to figure out exactly what he had been famous for. That was my first question when I stumbled on him. I had been looking for sources on Afro-Argentine history in the 20th century. And this is because, as I mentioned earlier, when I finished my first book on Brazil, which had been about Black intellectuals in Brazil in the 20th century who had written extensively about race and racism in Brazil, I thought it's so incredible to look at Argentina in the same period and see what appeared to be kind of a vacuum. And the problem with there being almost no written histories of Afro-Argentines in the 20th century is that it just kind of lent credibility to the idea of disappearance. And so if you knew that Afro-Argentines had not disappeared in the 20th century and you wanted to kind of make a robust argument that there had been continuity between, their very well documented 19th century presence and the activists who are making new claims for belonging and citizenship today, then I felt like as a historian, what I need to do is really try to write a history that shows that continuity, right? Crossing the threshold from the 19th to the 20th century, because in the 19th century, we have a very well documented Afro-Argentine presence, especially in Buenos Aires. There was a Black press, there were Black thinkers. It's not hard to document that presence, and it's been done very well by many of my Argentine colleagues. And it's not hard to see that in the early 21st century, there are Black movements composed both of people who descend from people enslaved on Argentine soil and from members of the diaspora. Other than oral histories and accounts of Afro-Argentines themselves, there was very little about the 20th century. So I thought, I really want to write a story about Blackness in the 20th century. And so I went to the National Archive in Argentina, and they said, well, most of our written collections are from the 19th century and earlier. But what we do have for the 20th century is a wonderful photographic archive. So I went to the photography archive and I looked through their filing system, and they had a category at the time, this was in 2010, called negros, which they then changed to Afroamericanos, and then I believe Afro-Argentinos or Afrodescendientes. And under the category negros, I found mostly what I expected, which was references to the 19th century or before. That is, references to the period in Argentine history in which it was, quote, accepted that there would have been Afro-Argentines. But then there were these 8 or 9 photos of a man who clearly lived in the 20th century. And one of them is the one of Raúl Grijera that is on the cover of my book, which was perhaps the most arresting of all the photos, because it is a studio photograph of this very handsome, young, Afro-Argentine man in his 20s, standing in a photography studio with like a very elaborate background with a plant on one side and a backdrop. And he's dressed elegantly head to toe in a tuxedo, but then he has kind of this jaunty hat, a straw hat on a rakish angle, and he's got a cane and he has a swing in his hip, and he's looking sort of defiantly just to one side of the camera. And I thought, wow, who is this man? And then I realized that there are photos of the same man several decades later when he's older, and you could tell that he is in much more precarious circumstances. He basically looks like a person who is unhoused and is walking around the city, crouching in doorways, always wearing the same kind of ragged clothing. And in a couple of photos, he's being trailed by a policeman who is right behind him. And in the latest photos where he looked most elderly, he seemed to be in some kind of mental institution or some kind of institution. He was flanked by, men in white coats. And so I thought, who is this man? And I turned over one of the photos. And the good thing is, the reason why the National Archive has these photos is that many of them belonged to what are called the morgues, as I'm sure you know as a journalist, which were the archives of newspapers and magazines, right? Where journalists would go to look up research on a topic, things that had been previously printed, photographs that had been taken. So several magazine and newspaper outlets that had closed in Argentina had sent their morgues or archives to be archived at the National Archive. And some of these photos were photos that had appeared in magazines and newspapers from the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. So I got lucky. On the back of one of them, I found a little snippet of an article about him. And I was able to kind of zero in on a range of years and the publication. And so I went and found that. And then I started, looking him up. A few things had been digitized, and I started pulling on hints and threads and sort of expanding my network of references. And, maybe 5 years into the research, I had collected almost 300 published sources on him, and I began to get a better sense of what his story was, which was actually, once you read against the grain and did some archival research and didn't just read the published sources, his story ended up being very different than what the published sources said about him.
Oh, you're a real detective.
It's a complete cliche, but it felt a little bit like detective work, especially because there's no one archive that you could go to that would have all the pieces of his life. In a sense, his life cut across so many different institutional facets of Argentine society in the early 20th century that I had to go to a lot of different places, including the archives of still functioning correctional and mental institutions, to find aspects of his file and his history. Yeah.
Fantastic. Paulina, we're living, for better or worse, in an age of identity politics. What sort of challenge have you faced as a white Argentine woman specializing in Afro-Latino history?
It is a challenge, but I feel like it is a fair challenge. I've been asked very fair questions about, how did you come to this? And what is your positionality? How do you, as a white person, engage with the political implications of doing this research? There is no perfect response to this. I struggle with this question. The way I think about it is that I'm trained as a historian. My skills are to write history and to do history. And I try to do that in the best way that I can, to serve the interests of racial justice as those goals are articulated by contemporary Black movements, and also by the people who are in the books that I'm writing about, right? I try to remain true and do justice to the ways of thinking and the ideas about politics and racial and social justice that the people I am writing about from the past are putting forth in their own work. I think that's something that people can do respectfully as long as they are in dialogue with and, you know, really listening to the demands that are coming out of the movements, right, of Afro descendants, who are the ones who have to deal, of course, most frontally with racial discrimination in Latin America. I think it became very clear to me in the case of Argentina that I would probably do more damage by just sitting out this conversation than by trying to get into it productively. Because Argentina is a place where, as I've mentioned before, the myth of white homogeneity has reigned supreme for so long. The recent census just came out, the one from 2020, which was done under COVID, and just over 3% of the population identified as Afro-Argentine. This is still an undercount, but it's more than doubled since the last census in 2010. But this is still a very small number of people who identify as Afro-descendant in Argentina. Argentina is still a place where, probably most Argentines believe that they live in a homogeneously white society, and where, with the exception of a very small group of scholars who focus on race, academia is not a place where race is still talked about very openly. And so I think that in a society like that, if people who identify as white are not engaged in the battle against racism and are not using the privilege that we have as white Argentines, as educated Argentines, and as, in my case, as an Argentine who is living in the United States and teaching at a very privileged institution, if I can't use that as a platform to help the Afro-Argentine movement put some of these goals on the agenda and into kind of public conversation, then I'm not sure what I can use this platform for, right? So that's how I think about it. My book just came out in Spanish in Argentina a couple of weeks ago, and I'm going to go to Argentina to do the formal book launch. And I've been in conversation with activists in the Afro-Argentine movement, trying to think about, other than put this book out there, what can I do? What can this book help to do? Can we think about writing lesson plans? I would love it if people in the movement and the Afro-Argentine youth that they work with could think about creative ways of writing new stories about Raul, right? He was defamed through cartoon strips and tango music, and now he could be resignified through all of those cultural forms. And that is something that I would love to see happen. And I just feel like, as a historian, I have the skill to kind of put some of these stories out there, and these are just some versions of his story, and hope that many others will emerge. So that's how I've been trying to think about it.
Thank you. Are you working on anything new right now?
I am. I have just started a new project with my Argentine colleague, Lea Heller, who is also a historian of Afro-Argentina. And we, again, sort of stumbled across, thanks to this incredible photography archive, the figure, this time of an Afro-Argentine woman who was in some ways similar to Raul, both very famous, but also infamous for seemingly being, quote, out of place in the late 19th century. And, when I was writing the book about Raul, I thought, okay, I guess it is possible, and this just shows that it is possible to write a book about Black visibility in Argentine society, despite the rhetoric of invisibility. We have to go do the work, right? To find these sources. But I thought, this visibility that he had, this fame that he had, it really has to do with the fact that he was a man. So he was disadvantaged in some ways by his race, his color, his appearance, but in other ways he was advantaged by his gender to be able to move in this bohemian world of the nightlife. I thought would this be possible for a woman? And then here's the story of Florentina Ferrari Diaz de Cruella, who was born in 1845, one or two generations removed from enslavement and from African birth on different sides of her family, and who by the 1870s had become famous and feared as a self-taught litigant who was a scourge to the police, the courts, the lawyers, the whole legal system of Buenos Aires, because she, at any given time, had about 70 lawsuits going against neighbors, employers, renters, police commissioners who abused her, lawyers and notaries who she claimed mistreated her, and most famously, members of her own family who she claimed were trying to steal her inheritance and to whose estates she very litigiously presented herself as the rightful heir. And so she basically lived a life from coming of age in the 1870s when the Argentine Civil Code had just been put in place, became an expert on the Civil Code, and lived the rest of her life litigating cases, spent 2 years in jail in one case for trying to simultaneously claim inheritance from two different fathers, which is a very interesting story, until her death in 1911. And then when she died, she was remembered in the popular press as one of Argentina's, perhaps Argentina's most impressive popular litigant.
How interesting.
Yeah, she's a fantastic
What a great
figure.
project. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Just thank you for this space. I'm delighted to be here at Harvard. I've been spending this first year largely getting to know the place and getting to know the people and trying to really do the work to connect with other faculty, graduate students. It's been a delight getting to know what the kinds of things that they're working on and just working with the Alari to build the Afro-Latin American Research Institute, to build the spaces to expand conversations in this field with activists, with scholars, with all kinds of producers of knowledge in Latin America and in the United States and beyond. So it's such a privilege. I'm very excited to start the next phase of my career here.
Thank you. You've been listening to Paulina Alberto. She's a historian of Afro-Latin American lives and a new faculty member here, professor of African and African American studies and of history. Thank you, Paulina.
Thank you, Jen.